1.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar on the impact of the Taliban's victory on other conflict involving jihadi militants. Crisis Group has presented many analyses and policy recommendations over the years on numerous conflicts involving these groups, based on extensive field research. We thought that today would be a good opportunity to discuss some of these elements with 3 Crisis Group panelists. Since we already organized several events about Afghanistan, we thought it would be more interesting to focus in particular on 3 other major conflicts. So the 3 panelists are Dalin Khalifa. She will elaborate on the Syrian conflict. Then Omar Mahmoud will speak about Somalia. And then Ibrahim Yahya will speak about the Sahel. Lucas Provost, with the head of the mediation and theme section at the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, will also introduce a few preliminary remarks. In terms of structure, the webinar is structured in 2 parts. First, we're going to discuss the consequences of the Taliban victory with our 3 panelists. Then, in 40 minutes, we will open the floor to our questions. When we ask the questions, please state clearly your name and affiliation before asking your questions in the Q&A box. I would like to remind you that the call is being recorded and live streamed on the Crisis Group's YouTube channel. So first, let me hand the floor to Luca Probst for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Jerome, and thank you for the invitation to this roundtable. As Jerome pointed out, I lead the thematic peace building unit in the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. And among others, I also oversee our program on preventing violent extremism. Switzerland has a long-standing partnership with ICG, which over time has evolved and covered various different issues. But I think at the heart of this relationship is the recognition that we can't do evidence-based policy without the insights provided by field-based research. And this is where ICG comes in, which through its analysts provides an essential ingredient for our work, in particular also in those areas of the world which tend to be overlooked and under-researched. I think it's safe to say that ICG's relevance, its professionalism and proximity to the field have become even more important in today's online world, where disinformation spreads ever more rapidly, and it often takes considerable amount of time to sift through the noise before you get to the information you really need. Now, on today's event, we've supported ICG's Jihad and Modern Conflict program since 2016. And I think there's no need to explain why it may be even more relevant today than when we started out. So today I'm particularly looking forward to an analysis which focuses not only on one context, but takes a transnational approach, starting with recent events in Afghanistan onto Syria, Somalia, and the Sahel, though I suspect the journey hardly ends there and other contexts could also have been added to this list. That said, one of the tenets of our PVE program is that it's important to look at root causes of conflict. And behind the label of jihadist groups, there are not only transnational networks, but also complex local realities which need to be accounted for and which will likely resist approaches that predominantly rely on military or security-led interventions. So events like the one today always provide us with a great opportunity to think about policy implications of ICG's work and critically review our own understanding of conflicts. And with that, I'd just like to thank you again, ICG, for organizing this event, and look forward to hearing from the panelists.
Thanks a lot, Lucas. So I will begin with you, Omar. Recently, you wrote about the situation in Somalia. You say that there are some parallels to be drawn between Somalia and Afghanistan, including the presence of an insurgent movement, al-Shabaab, that rules large part of the population. On the other hand, you also have the presence of foreign troops. Can you tell us more about those parallels and differences between Afghanistan and Somalia?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jerome, and everyone for organizing this event and the opportunity to be here. You know, I think I'd start by saying, of course, there's always a danger in conflating two contexts which are very different on the ground. But I do think there are some overarching parallels between the situation we've seen in Afghanistan and what's currently going on in Somalia today that are worth considering. But you know, we should start just with a few of the differences so we don't overreach here. You know, first of all, I do think al-Shabaab, you know, is not analogous to the Taliban. You know, have maybe some similar, you know, governance structures and methods and objectives, but of course the Taliban has much deeper experience there. Al-Shabaab hasn't really shown the desire for recognition as a legitimate governing actor that the Taliban has. And, you know, of course, it's still, you know, even though at its core, Somali movement engages in attacks outside its borders. And, you know, I think that's a really key difference when you look at the regional picture in Afghanistan compared to what we have in Somalia, where, you know, in the Horn of Africa, there's broad unity against al-Shabaab. And really, if you look at the security project ongoing in Somalia, it is a regional, driven by regional distaste for al-Shabaab. It's a regional project backed by external funding. So a bit of a different situation to Afghanistan, which of course had a regional safe haven. But, you know, having said that, I think if you zoom out a little bit, there are some similarities in terms of an externally backed state building project that emerged in the ashes of an invasion that destroyed a previous, you know, Islamist inclined political order. And since then, you've had this external state building project, which has really struggled to develop legitimacy on the ground, provide services to the population, and stand on its own, honestly, in both governance and security. And so you have this newer political order that's really dependent on external support for its survival. But in the short term, doesn't really seem to be transitioning into something broadly sustainable, or at least not at the pace that people would want to see. And so that begs the question about what we saw in Afghanistan, where what happens in that situation when you do see the pullout of external actors or the collapse of that order. And we saw, you know, what happened with the Taliban sort of victory. And so it raises, I think, important questions for if we saw, you know, a similar sign of fatigue and drawdown from Somalia, and we already see signs of international fatigue, what that would mean for the future government and the battle against al-Shabaab. And, you know, I think there's a lot of considerations, a lot of factors you can look at one way or other, but a common thread through many assessments is that the government, as it currently stands, you know, isn't really ready to be on its own just yet. And so I think that's where it brings about a bit of a worrying parallel.
That's really interesting. And so if we think in terms of perception, what was the perception of this Taliban victory from the standpoint of Shabaab?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to look at that aspect. You know, I think, you know, of course, al-Shabaab and its supporters have championed the Taliban takeover. You know, this is pretty clear in al-Shabaab's propaganda. They've been very much reporting about the Taliban's offensive across the country since that began, you know, back earlier this year. You know, very, you know, almost district by district kind of reporting what's going on there. And of course, we hear of celebrations in al-Shabaab controlled areas and whatnot as well. So you definitely see that aspect, you know, but an interesting aspect is at a leadership level, you know, they've been a little bit quiet. We haven't seen any major congratulatory messages, maybe the sorts we've seen for some other groups. And, you know, I think there's a little bit of a tension here as well in terms of portraying the fact that, you know, the Taliban did negotiate with the US to get to where they are today. And so some of the messaging has really downplayed the negotiations aspect and rather frame this more as just a US withdrawal. And, you know, I think there was a telling point, you know, in one interview we did with an elder who was quite supportive of al-Shabaab, you know, he noted it was very wrong for the Taliban to engage in discussions with the US, but the outcome was somehow right. And so it presented a bit of a conundrum, you know, which I think was a little interesting. But the bottom line is, of course, you know, there's been a celebration of this victory. It can serve as a source of inspiration going forward. You know, it can rejuvenate the group a little bit, especially if some were getting war weary. they can point to the fact that, hey, look, the Taliban fought for 20 years. We've been fighting for 15. So we're on the right path. Externals will leave one day. We already see signs of that. So stay the course. And so I think that ties into some of the wider messaging that al-Shabaab's already doing, some of the things that they've been saying, both locally and internationally. And so it fits in quite well with their narratives.
That's really interesting, thank you. And so if we go to another conflict, if we go to Syria, Darren, what can you tell us about the situation of HTS? Here we have a group that used to be an affiliate of al-Qaeda. We've heard of many communiques and communication where they similarly praised the Taliban victory. Can you tell us about what it means for the group in particular?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Jerome, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Well, a few quick points, Jerome, in response to your question. Well, first, you're absolutely right that HTS has been very quick to congratulate the Taliban on their takeover of Kabul. And when the Taliban signed the peace deal with the US back in 2020, HTS issued a very flattering statement congratulating them on their win. HTS has made a lot of enemies in the jihadist circles, both in Syria and beyond. The group has consistently slammed and bashed some of the most prominent international jihadists, calling them irrelevant and outdated and more. They, however, always kept a very positive tone towards the Taliban. And they've really looked up to their strategic pragmatism. They took note of what HTS saw as a savvy political engagement with regional and international actors. They've also kept a very close eye on every step of the Taliban's talks with the US and the successes and failures, and made reference to that in public, but also in private conversations we've had with them. That said, it's very important to also note that while HTS looks up to the Taliban's politics and pragmatism, they differ from them significantly, culturally and ideologically on key issues. Amongst the key differences between the two groups is that HTS has gone much farther than the Taliban in terms of their break with transnational jihadists. So while the Taliban, for instance, has kept this ambiguous relation with al-Qaeda, HTS has been systematically cracking down on AQ affiliates in Syria. And another thing they diverge on is their outlook to governance. So in contrast to the Taliban, HTS has stayed clear from trying to impose a harsh interpretation of Sharia in Syria. They haven't tried to impose their own curriculum in schools or ban women from education. On the contrary, HTS leadership brags about women constituting a significant portion of the students in universities and schools. They have not tried to ban gender mixed gatherings, and they also haven't tried to impose like specific dress codes on people, be it women or men. So they have a very different outlook to governance, and so it's also a very different culture in that sense. And I think to clarify that, the head of HTS, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, has once told us in a meeting that while he thinks governance should be consistent to Islamic Sharia, he doesn't think, and with local traditions, he doesn't envision that kind of governance that is similar to what ISIS was trying to impose in Syria. And he went as far as saying it also needs to be very different than what Saudi Arabia is trying to impose. So I think they're trying to reposition themselves as a very local focused organization that abides by more of the conservative traditions in Syria rather than anything that the Taliban had tried to impose in the past. Now, a major divergence also between the Taliban and HTS has been around the issue of guerrilla warfare and imposition of insurgent tactics. And we can delve deeper into that because I think that's a major and fundamental difference between the two groups. But I'll stop here and happy to delve deeper into it if you think it's useful, Jerome. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. I think we'll go back to this particular point later on. So now we are going to go to the Sahel. We're going to speak to Ibrahim. There have been many talks recently about the French intervention in the Sahel, about what has happened for the past few years, the French lessons, about what can happen in the next future. So Ibrahim, can you tell us more about the current situation? Are the French going to simply imitate the Americans and withdraw their military forces from the Sahel?
Well, the quick answer to your question is no. The French are not just withdrawing as the US did in Afghanistan. But let me just make a few points before coming to that. First, the situation is in the Sahel is not getting any better. Both sides currently are locked in a mutually hurting stalemate, as they both suffer major casualties, with no one appearing capable of achieving a unilateral victory. And the death toll has been rising since the last 3 years, and the political situation is quite unstable, in particular in Mali, where we have witnessed 2 coups since August of the last year. So the French authorities, who have engaged over 5,000 of their troops in counterterrorism efforts, are showing fatigue and exasperation with this lack of progress that I just described. Paris has recently endeavored to profoundly restructure its military presence. In June, President Macron recognized that the military strategy that they have followed in the region has not been appropriate to addressing the conflict, and he decided to operate some major changes. Among those major changes is announcing the end of the Barkhane mission, the closing down of military bases in northern Mali, in particular in Kidal, Tessalit, and Timbuktu, and also downsizing the size of the troops from the 5,000 that I mentioned before to a maximum of 3,000 troops. But this restructuring doesn't mean a withdrawal, and the French authorities have been very clear on that. They have insisted that they will maintain their military engagement as long as the Sahelian partners want them to continue this engagement. They explain the restructuring, saying that it is a need to adapt to a new dynamics of the conflict, the evolving jihadist tactics in the region. But also, they said the restructuring is aimed at preparing the national forces so that they could by themselves take over the burden of defending and protecting the country. But this is a French way of explaining it. The Sahelian authorities have a different way of understanding it. In particular, in Mali, the Malian government just used this to justify to justify a new decision that is taken to diversify its partners on the military ground, saying that the French have decided unilaterally to restructure and withdraw from some of their areas, exposing the country to its enemies. And for that, they need to also readapt themselves and have other partners to come in. In particular, there's a lot of discussion now about Russian mercenaries that they will be deployed in the country.
That's really interesting. And similarly to what we see with Shebab in Somalia, with HTS in Syria, what is the perception of the local affiliate, JNIM, about what happened in Afghanistan?
So the JNIM acclaimed the US Taliban negotiation first, that led to the withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan. But also they acclaimed the Taliban's takeover as a victory of jihad in general. The JNIM issued 2 statements on that. One in August, when in which JNIM leader Iyad al-Ghali himself published a triumphant message labeling the restructuring of the French authorities and intervention as a victory for JNIM, and congratulating the Taliban on the historic withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan. 2 weeks later, on August 23, JNIM and the AQIM this time published a joint statement in which they congratulated the Afghan people for this victory, drawing the lesson that jihad is the only way to liberate the Muslim Ummah, from these foreign invasions. As this message shows, the Taliban takeover has a galvanizing effect for JNIM in particular. It is raising morale among the Jenin fighters, it has exposed, I think, the limits of counterterrorism effort that rely heavily on Western foreign troops, and has demonstrated how a local jihadist movement can win through tenacity and determination, eventually overcoming a broad international counterterrorism coalition. And this for a group like Jenin is a big lesson, and they keep putting this forward to show how proud they are with what the Taliban achieved. But it is unlikely that the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan directly impacts the current balance of power. Let us be clear on that. It's clear, while Jenin has pledged allegiance to the Taliban and other al-Qaeda networks, there is little evidence of concrete link between the two, or even a flow of material support from one to another. In the past, in the 90s and the 2000s, a few jihadist combatants from the Sahel-Saharan region went to Afghanistan to fight. But these veterans of Afghanistan, as they are known here in the Sahel, do not play any significant role. And I don't think there is any material support that will flow through them, that could flow to them to impact the situation in the Sahel currently.
That's really interesting. And I think your three presentations somehow raise the question of violence. Since the Taliban's victory, we heard many talks about the galvanizing effect of what happened in Afghanistan elsewhere. Some people portray it as a victory for al-Qaeda that will just increase and lead to an escalation of violence in different contexts. So if we follow the same order, if we start with Somalia, will the Taliban victory directly affect violence in Somalia?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I think I'd follow the logic of what Ibrahim was presenting, in that, you know, I'm not sure it'll have major ramifications locally, you know, when it comes to al-Shabaab conducting attacks or, you know, their posturing. And the main reason for that is, you know, I think the local context is much more important than what happens, you know, thousands of miles away. And, you know, in Somalia, we already actually see al-Shabaab in a very strong position due to a number of local factors. You know, you have a government that over the past few years has probably been more focused on internal politics than the struggle against al-Shabaab. And so I think that's taken a little bit of the tenor out of the fight against al-Shabaab. And, you know, in some regions, we've had al-Shabaab actually actively take advantage of political infighting to expand their influence. And, you know, the other side is the past few years, we've had this adjustment on the part of al-Shabaab where they've been able to exert influence in areas they don't physically control. You know, it's almost like this mafia type extortive element, which is underpinned by very strong local intelligence capacities and, of course, the brutal threat of force. But it extends even into the capital in Mogadishu. And, you know, so the net effect, I think, of these kind of more local dynamics is that al-Shabaab already can essentially pick and choose the time and place of its attacks. It's already generating a very healthy financial balance. You know, the group already recruits quite locally. So, you know, really, we already see a lot of violence in the strong position from al-Shabaab, but it's more a direct result of these conditions that put them in that stronger position than anything else. You know, and just to hammer that point home, you know, I do think the group is quite self-sufficient as well. You know, it's thoroughly Somali outfit, you know, maybe some regional elements, but it doesn't really need that much from external groups in order to thrive. You know, having said that, al-Shabaab is still, you know, quite aligned to al-Qaeda, and so a Taliban victory that allows al-Qaeda to become ascendant in some sort of way perhaps could have a bit of an impact. But again, you know, I think this would be minimal because the group is so local and self-sufficient. And, you know, I would argue, you know, they are a successful entity mainly because of those factors, because they've been able to thrive locally and generate, you know, what they need to do locally. So I think, you know, they tend to look abroad maybe for in the inspiration aspect and kind of, you know, support their idea that they're part of this global struggle of jihadism. But really, that's more the dynamic and the effect we could see rather than some actual changes on the ground.
That's really interesting. And if we take the same subject to Syria, Darren, you did mention some things about military tactics, about the Taliban as a potential model that people would mention on HTS. So what's reality? Is HTS looking to simply replicate the military model that the Taliban has paved the way for, or are they looking for something different?
Yes. So, I mean, as I mentioned briefly, one of the core and strategic divergence in tactics between HTS and the Taliban has been the pursuance of guerrilla warfare, or what is known in Arabic as Harb al-Isabat. While the Taliban reaped the benefit of maintaining a low-level insurgency for almost 2 decades, HTS has shifted away completely from asymmetrical attacks and publicly endorsed ceasefire agreements. This has been a long-standing point of contention amongst jihadist groups in Syria, namely between HTS and other hardline Salafi jihadists. HTS has consistently prioritized holding territory and controlling Idlib over maintaining a low-level insurgency, and has also compromised militarily and ideologically towards that end. This meant, in essence, committing to ceasefire agreements negotiated by other parties, including Turkey, and reining in other jihadist groups in Syria who went against these ceasefires. In return, of course, for Turkish military protection and for maintaining their control over Idlib. In contrast, for instance, al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri has consistently criticized HTS for that. He's advocated for a different strategy, mainly shifting to guerrilla war of attrition aimed at destroying the enemy's morale by inflicting unsustainable losses, rather than actually prioritizing territorial control. And many other Salafi jihadist groups within HTS and out of HTS in Syria have also criticized the group for their commitment to such ceasefires, and they've accused them of abandoning the notion of jihad altogether. I mean, understating the benefits of insurgent tactics hasn't been an easy job for the HTS and for its leadership, and the Taliban's victory is not going to make it any easier for them. Refraining from fighting Damascus, from fighting the Syrian regime and its Russian backers is deeply unpopular in rebel-controlled parts of Syria. I mean, for thousands of Syrians who've been displaced as a result of the regime's military tactics and who are facing constant bombardment and shelling by the regime and by its Russian backers, abandoning the notion of fighting the regime and abandoning the notion of the insurgency altogether is not something a lot of people can really fathom, even when there's no realistic hope for their victory. So HTS has been really walking this very tight rope in both their rhetoric and their dealings and their teachings to the rank and file. So they've been maintaining an anti-regime rhetoric, if I may say, while continuing to emphasize the pragmatic imperative of committing to ceasefire arrangements and limiting their military force to defending against regime offensives. So, I mean, the Taliban's rise to power might give breath to those within HTS and other jihadists in Syria who are opposing HTS's military restraint. And what we've seen recently is the leadership coming out publicly explaining the differences in context. So Abdurrahim Atun, the highest religious figure at HTS, gave a recent public talk on jihad and resistance in the Muslim world, where he explained at length the local and regional differences between them and the Taliban. He laid out the core factors that differentiate them from the Taliban model, including the demography and the topography of both countries. He particularly emphasized that projecting the Taliban's military tactics on Syria would be incredibly premature, and that pursuing guerrilla warfare would provoke a very strong military reaction from Russia and the Syrian regime. What was really interesting is that he pointed out that the US's tactics in Afghanistan was targeted attacks against the Taliban, unlike Russia and the regime that have a scorched earth strategy and that they're going to inflict collective punishment on the population under their control. He emphasized that because he was trying to explain that there is no way for them to pursue guerrilla warfare without really forfeiting control over Idlib altogether. And while this argument makes a lot of practical sense because of the imbalance of power in favor of Damascus and its backers, you can still hear voices, even within the more pragmatic elements of HTS, really implying that Western countries only negotiate and only engage with groups that prove to be a formidable military protagonist. So there is still this sentiment within HTS that thinks that they need to show force in order for countries to take them seriously and to engage with them.
That's fascinating, really interesting. Thanks, Darin. If we go back again to the Sahel, Ibrahim, you did mention some impact locally as well on JNIM. And so how can we see the impacts of what happened on JNIM in particular? Will they just feel comforted that somehow going through military armed struggle will allow them to achieve their objectives?
Well, let me say that it is JNIM's theory of change that they cannot defeat France, in fact, militarily, but they can deny them victory. They think that if they continue in this war of attrition that they have followed since the beginning of this conflict, France will get bogged down in a protracted war that will exhaust its army and wear out its will to fight. So this is what they pledge on. It is clear for that JNIM is looking forward it's looking at the US-Taliban deal that led to the withdrawal of Afghanistan and a model that they could emulate. In several statements that JNIM made, they make reference to that deal between the US and the Taliban as a source of inspiration. In one of these statements, JNIM addresses France saying, "It is in your interest to depart from our land now, just as the Americans departed from Afghanistan." So this is a statement that JNIM made, and several others in which they talk about how the Americans departed from Vietnam, or how the French themselves departed from Algeria, saying that in the end, you will have to depart from this land. In fact, in recent statements to reassure Paris, but this is before the Taliban took over, the JNIM made even a step forward to try to reassure Paris, emphasizing that JNIM has never targeted France's homeland with an attack. And this is a way for them to echo the guarantee that the Taliban offered the United States, and which rendered the US-Taliban deal possible. So this shows how they are really eager to achieve that result. The problem with JNIM in trying to do that is that while they accept negotiations, they condition any negotiation with the Malian part by the withdrawal of French troops. So it's not for them, they do not accept to engage directly with the French to negotiate withdrawal of the French forces, but they make it as a precondition for any dialogue to take place. And this for sure makes more complicated in terms of achieving that withdrawal, if any withdrawal is to be. As I mentioned before, France is not intentioning to withdraw from that region anytime soon.
That's really interesting, thank you. So we've covered the more military dynamics, but if we look at it more broadly about what happened in Afghanistan, it was not only a military victory for the Taliban, it was achieved through a combination of military pressure and political negotiations with the US. This is the perception of many groups, as mentioned previously by Darin about HTS more specifically. Omar, very recently you wrote an op-ed for Foreign Policy. You presented some of the important lessons about what happened in Afghanistan, in particular the fact that the negotiation did not involve a local partner. So can you tell us and elaborate about the possibilities even of negotiations in Somalia? We have three sides. We have the government, the international community, and the Shabab. What is the situation at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting dynamic to look at how those negotiations happened in the Afghanistan case and see what worked and what didn't. And I think some of the central lesson, when we're applying this maybe to the Somalia context, is something about the sequencing. In Afghanistan, you saw this negotiation between the US around its exit strategy before you had the focus then on the outreach on a political settlement. And then, those second part of the negotiations really didn't take off. And we rather saw this kind of rushed withdrawal effort. And so, I think the takeaway is if you want to look at other contexts, you might need to reverse that order. You might need to think about how you actually leverage maybe the waning withdrawal or the waning interest of externals, into some sort of broader political settlement. Now, I think this is very difficult in the Somalia context. It is a difficult prospect. I think if you talk to people working in that area or people, living in Somalia, very few feel it's time to engage al-Shabaab. On one side, they argue the group is too strong right now. There's really no need for them to engage. The government can't offer much of anything enticing enough, and that there's been no demonstrated interest on al-Shabaab's side. And that's all true. On the other side, for the government, you can argue that they need more time, basically, to continue to build up the Somali security forces to take the fight to al-Shabaab. And maybe, you continue what you've been doing, some off-ramps to incite those who want to leave the group, these defection programs, while the government also consolidates its house as well. But at the same time, I think there's a bit of a tension there because everyone will also say, eventually this struggle will end in dialogue as there is no military solution. But they just want the government to be in a dominant position when that happens, or to basically really break al-Shabaab first and have them be the ones who sue for talks. But I wonder if by going with that approach, we're just kind of extending the ball game and maybe making the same mistakes over and over. It's already been 15 years. We've seen how much the government has progressed, and it has certainly. I don't want to say it hasn't, but perhaps not as quickly as people would like to see. We've probably seen the high watermark for external security efforts in Somalia and the support around that. And we've seen how adaptable al-Shabaab's been, and it's been able to stay one step ahead of its adversaries. And so I think it's very difficult to maybe, say, just continuing the current approach is going to yield different results. It's not to say that you can put the military side apart, but I do think it's time to think about some other approaches. And one of those would be, of course, trying to engage the group. And I admit it's very difficult, and there's some key barriers. Not least that al-Shabaab is still very associated with al-Qaeda, and that it has still a commitment to engage in regional violence, and those would be clear red lines. Things that the group would have to give up to make anything work. But at the same time, I think talking to the group seriously, trying to engage them, hasn't been tried in a while. So it's worth an outreach because you never know how they'll react until you engage in that route. Or if you're not there yet, that there still needs to at least be a political strategy to get to to that table, to get to that side of the talks, because that can take a long time. And we always say it's going to kind of end up there, but the only focus is on the military side. There's no focus on some of the other aspects then. Otherwise, I think we're just looking at a continuation of the status quo, and who knows how long that could go on for. So that's a bit unsatisfying, I'd say.
That's really interesting. Actually, if we look at Syria, Darin and Crisis Group, you have argued for a long time that it might be that HTS is willing to engage the international community. The case has been made repeatedly, but has there been any change since then? Is the international community actually ready to engage HTS? And if not, what are the remaining obstacles?
So the short answer to that is no. The long answer is, for a very long time, two views mainly prevailed in Western capitals about HTS in Idlib, right? One view was that a Russian-backed Syrian regime offensive on Idlib and on HTS is kind of inevitable, and perhaps even more desirable from a CT perspective. And the other view was that Turkey can and should deal with Idlib and with the HTS conundrum. And so there's no need really for Western countries to engage in the process, and they can just outsource that to Turkey. I think both of these views have proven to be short-sighted. HTS has demonstrated that it's quite strong, locally rooted, and very well entrenched in society, that trying to uproot it militarily would come at a grave human cost. Today, Turkish military presence in Idlib has created significant military deterrence. It basically installed a military stalemate, but it's far from addressing the HTS conundrum, let alone the broader jihadist question of Idlib. Also, HTS has shown a great deal of pragmatism. They've shred their transnational ties and connections. They've systematically, as I mentioned, cracked down on ISIS and AQ affiliates in the area. They've completely silenced, marginalized, and often kicked out those who oppose these transformations, whether within the group or outside of the group. They've also committed to ceasefire arrangements and remained mostly on the defense when it came to the Syrian regime in Russia. And they've been since then trying to gradually open up to Turkey, but also to international actors. So, I mean, two issues, however, remain at stake here, or remain at play here when it comes to Western engagements with HTS. One is the lack of Western willingness to engage with a group like HTS at a time where they don't really constitute a threat to the West and to Western interests. And the second is a broader policy vacuum, because there's not really a policy, there's no playbook on how to engage with a designated terrorist organization, even if they've taken demonstrable steps to move away from their past. And I think, this is something that we've been arguing consistently, as you mentioned, Jerome, that this is particularly problematic for those in Western policy circles who have been advocating for ending Western military engagement in what they describe as the forever wars. And they are keen on finding non-kinetic approaches to militant Islamist groups. And so this policy vacuum continues. I think the case of HTS is a clear case in point where this vacuum is really has massive consequences. So again, short answer to your question, I don't see any willingness, unfortunately, and it is something that continues to exacerbate existing problems in Idlib.
Thank you, that's extremely insightful. Ibrahim, I know that you're going to publish a report very shortly in the next week or 2 weeks about negotiations with JNIM in the Sahel. So for people who are attending, can you tell us a bit more about the report? What is the situation from the standpoint of local authority, the international community, including France, about JNIM? Are negotiations going to happen? If they are, what would be the steps? So what is the situation now?
Well, thank you very much, Jerome. So 2 years ago, no one among the major actors in the Sahel, in particular between the jihadists and the state authorities, were willing, or at least were open to the idea of engaging dialogue to settle the bloody conflict that has opposed them. Since February 2020, we saw a change in the positions. First, the government of Mali decided that they are open to explore the way of dialogue with the jihadist leaders, in particular, Iyad al-Ghali and Hamadoun Koufa, who are the leader of, one is the leader of JNIM and the other one is the leader of the Katiba Masina, which is part of JNIM. A month later, JNIM published a statement in which it welcomed the government's decision to explore the way of dialogue, but they conditioned the entering dialogue with the withdrawal of foreign forces, including the French forces and the UN peacekeeping mission. So from here, we saw the perspective of at least two major actors changed in favor of dialogue. The third actor, the major actor, is France, which has championed the hardline position when it comes to engaging directly a dialogue between the jihadists and the state authorities. And the French has indeed rebucked the idea of dialogue, saying that it's going to lead to nowhere, and it is going to be a deal with a jihadist with a lot of blood on their hands. So here are the three positions. The idea of the paper that we are trying to publish is to say that from that statement of saying we agree to engage in dialogue, even if no actual dialogue is taking place in the region, how do we move to creating the conditions where dialogue can take place? This is filling a gap between accepting to engage to how we can actually engage in that dialogue. In the policies that were put forward in terms of that report is to say that we need to diffuse some of the resistance. There are resistance not only with the French authorities, but also resistance within the Malians themselves. A lot of leaders who think that dialogue might open up the gates of power to the jihadists. Others who are very skeptical that there is no way that we can achieve a deal in which government will accept Sharia, and if there is no accepting Sharia, then it's difficult for the jihadists to accept to come to the table. So the idea is how do we diffuse this resistance among the international community, but also among the locals who are skeptical about it. The second policy that we're thinking is to actually create teams of negotiators to try to see how, with those teams, it will be easier to engage in the actual work and discussions between the actors. So those are the ideas that we are putting forward. I would like to underline that it is not only, while France is against it, there are other actors in the international communities that are open to the idea of dialogue. The UN Secretary General has expressed himself in favor of that engagement, in particular with Geneva, but not with ISGS, the other major jihadist coalition in the region, but also African Union has some of the leaders of the institutions have expressed themselves in favor of that dialogue. So what we are trying to do with the report is to explore all this perspective, and based on the analysis of all this perspective, how do we move forward toward actual engagement between the jihadists and the authorities.
Thank you. Really looking forward to the report. So first, I would like to thank all the panelists. I think we've covered the wider situation. What are the conditions? What are the actors present in those regions? The impact of the Taliban's victory on both political and military dynamics. So I would like to thank you. It was very comprehensive. Now I would like to open up the floor to the public. So if you have any particular question, please write your name, affiliation, and the questions in the Q&A panel. Then we'll try to respond to as many questions as possible. We have between 15 to 25 minutes, depending on remaining time. So I will already take a few questions that were asked to the panelists. First, we have one question to Omar. Are foreign powers really interested and committed to engaging with Shabab?
Yeah, I mean, I think you get different responses depending on the countries. You've seen some that have tried this, whether that's, some from Scandinavia or, Qatar's kind of pushed that as well. But then you kind of, I think, need to look at also, why they tried that, what they've tried in the past. But wider, beyond, I think there's still a great deal of skepticism within the international community. I think a lot of countries are kind of trying to rethink their policies in Somalia, especially in the wake of what's happened in Afghanistan. A lot are asking these questions. A lot are asking if, maybe al-Shabaab can be engaged, but haven't really decided that that's necessarily the route or that's, the immediate future as well. And, I think, the US role is particularly interesting here because you do have, this desire to end forever wars, and you had the repositioning of US troops out of Somalia in the waning days of the Trump administration. But you still have this view that, al-Shabaab is a threat to US interests in the region, and even, sometimes this idea that somehow it's a threat to the US homeland as well, which, might be an exaggeration of what al-Shabaab is and its ambitions or its capabilities, but that narrative is still there. So I think there's still some key red lines, and these are what I kind of mentioned earlier, and that's, how al-Shabaab is still very much within the al-Qaeda network, even if it's a local and self-sufficient movement, and also how it still, engages in these regional attacks. It doesn't confine itself to Somalia's borders. And, even going further than that, there's an issue here in terms of not even just being a regional issue, but being an issue of where al-Shabaab sees itself as a defender of Somalis wherever they inhabit. So that would also involve, eastern Ethiopia and northern Kenya. And so rather than just confining itself to Somalia's colonial boundaries. And so I think there's a few issues and a few hurdles there that would need to be worked out. And I think, the wider desire on the part of international partners is maybe to think about this question, but hasn't really gone further down that route because of some of these red lines that keep popping up, and because we haven't seen a good way to overcome them. So I think that's a huge challenge. And the last point I'd make on that is, even if the federal government of Somalia ever did try to engage seriously the group in negotiations or dialogue, I don't think that could be successful unless you had this wider coherence, both from the region, which obviously looks at al-Shabaab quite suspiciously, but also the international partners beyond that. I think there'd have to be, a number of steps that the government would have to take before they could get to that point. And one of them is ensuring this coherence behind some sort of plan that they're leading with, both regionally and internationally.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Now we have a second question to Ibrahim. Often when we speak about insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, states that are leading counterinsurgencies are often arguing that maybe they have to adapt their military strategies and somehow copy the insurgents, having more flexible ground troops to fight the insurgents the way the insurgent fights. Do we have similar debates among the French military? Do the French military want to adapt somehow their military strategy as well in order to fight the local militant groups?
Well, yes, I think the restructuring, actually, the idea of restructuring the military deployment of the France goes in that line, because going with big armors, to go fight to go find the jihadists and fight them is not working. You will, if you wander around the Sahel in Niger or near the border of Mali, you will see a patrol of French military and national armies that goes of hundreds of military equipments that are going tracking the jihadists. They do not find anybody, because before they get there, already the jihadists have been informed and they have slipped away. So it has not been working. Having military troops, large size of military troops moving in the villages to try to find the jihadists is not working. So the idea is that let us do less of that and let us focus on intelligence and on aerial using drones and aerial equipments in order to bomb them to do airstrikes, And most of the successes that Barkhane has had is through airstrikes, not through on-ground operations. So over this. Throughout the region, there is this idea that we need to change the tactics. We need to use more of mobile troops. It has brought, and there are changes that happened. The Nigerian government did it since they received a lot of attacks that killed hundreds of militaries in late 2019 to 2020. So they changed their strategy in order to make it more mobile, to try to use more mobile patrols, etc., to fight the jihadists. It brought back some results in the sense that I think the power relation, at least in some of the area of northern Tilaberi, shifted in favor of the army. But it is only temporary because the jihadists are also quick to change their strategies. If you start using the intelligence, local intelligence, to try to track them down, then they attack the local communities. And by that, they instigate intercommunal violence and oblige the communities on which the armies rely to push them out of the area, and so to create a lot of displacement of the local populations. So that's what they did, and by doing that, they undermined the government strategies, but also they put at risk the stability of the entire region and the communities by instigating illuminate intercommunal violence. So this is what we saw. We have to come to realize that really this conflict is not going to be won only by military actions. We have to, on top of the military operations, we have to also add political solutions, or even subordinate the military solution to political solutions. This is what comes first, and I think the armies, including the French and the national armies, need to come to that conclusion.
That's extremely interesting. Thank you. Now we have one question for Darin about Syria. So HTS has become very much locally rooted, entrenched, embedded with the population, but there is still a strong Russian Russian opposition to engaging HTS and to put pressure on Turkey to do something about HTS. So what is Turkey's strategy? Are they trying to somehow marginalize HTS, or to put pressure on HTS and reduce their centrality or their military hegemony vis-a-vis other more pro-Turkish faction in northwest Syria?
Right. So Russian strategy towards Idlib and towards HTS doesn't really differ much than its strategy towards any other area of Syria or towards any other more moderate rebel group. They have been adamant and very keen on reinstating government control over every inch of Syria. They have not compromised 1 inch towards any opposition group anywhere, and I don't see them budging with HTS or with any other actor for that matter. So I don't think Russian desire to retake Idlib is going to necessarily change if Turkey would deal with the HTS conundrum. I think that's a pretext, and I do think that it's become very clear in Ankara that Russia is just going to continue to use that as a pretext for launching potential or future operations in Idlib. Now, I think there's also conviction in Ankara, as I mentioned, that HTS has become too strong, too deeply rooted, and too entrenched to be rooted out militarily without creating a new wave of refugees coming their way. Turkey already has over 3 million Syrians residing in Turkey, and any potential wave of refugees is going to create a real political crisis in the area. So to your question, how is Turkey going to respond to Russian escalation or Russian pressure? What's been happening since the March 2020 ceasefire is that, well, everyone's been generally abiding, but Russia's been also sporadically targeting, Russia and the regime have been sporadically targeting urban centers, or population centers. So they've been striking near IDP camps and near civilian centers. And I think the objective of that is to basically put a lot of pressure on HTS and Turkey, because it really is, as I said, deeply unpopular to commit to ceasefires at a time where there's constant shelling from the other side. So what's going to happen, in my view, is that Russia is going to continue to put Turkey and HTS in this awkward position for as long as they possibly can, hoping to break their presence, to end their presence in a way. I don't necessarily think that's achievable militarily. Today, Turkey has over 10,000 troops on the ground in Idlib. It is significant. I think, however, that could happen politically as part of a quid pro quo of some sort between Turkey and Russia, in which Russia raises the cost of Turkish presence in the area, so they reach an understanding of some sort on Turkey pulling back their military presence. There is no prospect for that happening in the near future, I don't think, again, because Idlib is a strategic and national security concern for Turkey. I don't think there's anything that Russia has to offer to Turkey in return that would really counter or mitigate the impact of having a new wave of refugees coming their way. I know that this didn't really answer your question, and every actor now is kicking the can down the road, but this has been the Syrian conflict for the last 10 years. Everyone's been trying to buy time and hold their ground as long as they possibly could.
No, thank you. It's actually very helpful. Now we turn again to Omar. You mentioned earlier different views within al-Shabaab. You know, for example, they praise the Taliban victory, but somehow reluctant about the principle of negotiations. Al-Shabaab is very secretive as an organization. Can you tell us more about those internal dynamics? Do we know of different factions supporting different standpoints on this issue?
So the question around internal dynamics in al-Shabaab is certainly a difficult one to answer, because the group hasn't been, as open as maybe others, and we haven't really seen them respond to also this idea of whether a dialogue or engagement is possible either. I think the thing we'd have to say is that, al-Shabaab has been over the past few years very persistent in repressing divergent viewpoints within their own organization. And so, a few years ago, there was a big purge of very high-ranking leaders within al-Shabaab that didn't necessarily have the same vision, that, maybe were a bit more national, maybe somewhere, some clan focused, that kind of wanted to pursue things in a different direction. And a very serious purge. Some of them were killed, others basically fled and defected to the federal government. And so, you had that kind of consolidation within the organization, one. But the other impact of that, I think, has been that, alternative viewpoints aren't really expressed out in the open. The next time we saw this happen was when there was the rise of the Islamic State. And there was a lot of overture to al-Shabaab, both publicly from the Islamic State to say, hey, come over to our side, but also internally within the movement. There were some that questioned that and kind of also brought out that idea. And again, you had this very strong internal repression against that. And some members were killed, some fled. There was a very small offshoot that did wind up leaving al-Shabaab and declaring to the Islamic State, but al-Shabaab has very much pursued that since then. And they've really attacked that group a number of times and done, honestly, been one of the better checks on that group. So I don't think you see this sort of interaction that you did maybe 10 years ago about al-Shabaab's direction. You don't see it as much anymore because it is so repressed, it is so internal. We have been doing some work where we try to reach out to some who've recently defected from al-Shabaab to kind of get that sense. And clearly, if defections are happening, there are people in the movement that aren't unhappy with the way things are going. But the general narrative that they've said is, we could never express that while we were in the movement. There was no sort of mechanism. There's no sort of ability to do that. They say our suspicion is there's many others that felt like us, but we don't talk about that openly. So I think it's hard to really kind of get into the inner weeds of the organization. I think they've been very good about providing that cover. I think you could look at maybe some certain leaders and maybe kind of tease it out, but this is why I always say, I don't think we're going to really know until we actually try this idea kind of seriously, how they would react.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Indeed, al-Shabaab has always been much more secretive than other groups like HTS. Very difficult to understand those local dynamics. There is one question that I will answer that is more general about the Taliban. How do we position the Taliban within the Sunni-Shia divide? What is the relation with the Muslim Brotherhood? The peculiarity of the Taliban is that it's not Salafi, it's a traditionalist group. It's, in terms of religious creed, it does not adhere to the same belief systems. It has really, it draws from a very different religious tradition that historically don't have the same issue and the same antagonism that many Salafis do have on the particular Shia questions. And it seems that the Taliban has been willing to openly reach out to Shia communities in Afghanistan. So their commitment will still have to be analyzed, but they want to send signals at least that they're not looking for an escalation. Conversely, they've been repressing more specifically Salafi communities that somehow are being accused of harboring IS-linked militants. And similarly, it's not modernist like movements like the Muslim Brotherhood. We only have a few minutes, so we're going to conclude with one question to Darin. Somehow there is a tension in the American position, which is quite paradoxical when we look at it from outside. On the one hand, they've been willing to engage directly with the Taliban, to negotiate with the Taliban, and ultimately the agreement that was signed between both groups did not even force the Taliban to openly reject al-Qaeda as an organization. Only that regional and international security will be secured, that they will not harbor militants that are threatening regional order. On the other hand, we have HTS, a group that has openly targeted al-Qaeda, that has dismantled the organization, done similarly on that has adopted similar position on IS. So a bit provocative question: what does that tell us about the U.S. policy and about how militant groups should understand it?
Thanks, Jerome. I mean, you really put your finger on the paradox or on the contradiction of U.S. policy towards some of the jihadist insurgent groups. And in terms, I mean, as I said, there is this policy vacuum, of course, but there's also an understanding that if a group is not really threatening to the West, and if they're no longer a threat to Western interests, then there's no actual need to take the political risk of engaging with them, because of course, engaging with such groups comes at a cost. And I think that paradox is going to continue for a while, where the US is quite keen on ending their heavy reliance on military tactics abroad, but they're also they can't come up with a formula to engage with such groups in a way that would mitigate the risk. And one of the things we have tried as crisis group to put forward in our policy prescriptions and engagement with a group like HTS is to basically say, well, the group has taken demonstrable steps in terms of dissociating itself from transnational jihad, yet its domestic and local conduct remains very problematic. And potentially any engagement with the group should be conditional on them taking concrete steps towards the over 3 million Syrians currently living under their control. We also basically put forward some clear benchmarks as suggestions for Western countries who would like to explore direct or indirect engagement with HTS. And we really do think these standards, like countries should come up with joint standards. They should also clarify what the expectations are from a group like HTS, both on their external behavior, but also on their internal governance in dealing with civil society and so on and so forth. But I mean, these benchmarks need to be clear. They need to be tangible, and they also need to be reciprocated. And that's where the introduction of carrots and sticks really need to be thought through more. There needs to be a thinking and rethinking of how to use Western leverage in a smart way that won't backfire, and in a way that would really help the local population, and will also preserve Western interests.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists for your contribution, for responding to the questions. I am sorry for the public. There are many other questions we didn't have the time to answer, in particular about Lake Chad, about Southeast Asia, and so on. But we're going to have a few additional publications on these particular issues. So first, we're going to have a large overview of militant responses, including in these regions, by next week. Then we're going to have a long report about negotiations with NIM. And in October, we are going to also publish another additional report about negotiating with jihadi groups in general. What does that mean? What does that occur? What are the practicalities, challenges, risks? Just be aware that this is forthcoming. Thank you for coming, and looking forward to another meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.